The sky over Germany, on the morning of December 20th, 1943, was the kind of cold that penetrates steel and flesh alike. A bone-deep cold at 27,000 feet, where the temperature sits at 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In the thin air above Bremen, 546 American heavy bombers formed a stream 8 miles long, their contrails marking the sky like chalk lines drawn across a blackboard. These were the flying fortresses and liberators of the 8th Air Force, and they carried death in their bomb bays. 3-ton payloads meant for the shipyards and aircraft factories that fed Germany's war machine. Inside one of those bombers, a young man from West Virginia was about to have his first day as an aircraft commander, and his last day thinking war was something you could understand. Second Lieutenant Charles Lester Brown, 21 years old, though he'd told his crew he was 25, to seem more confident, sat in the left seat of a B-17F Flying Fortress named the Old Pub, a name painted on the nose, along with a cartoon of a mug of beer. Brown was the youngest of 6 children from a farming family in West Virginia, a place where the mountains rolled green and peaceful, where the most dangerous thing in his childhood had been a temperamental mule or a copperhead snake in the woodpile. He'd enlisted in the army back in 1939, when he was just 17, drawn to it more by the promise of steady pay than any particular martial spirit. But after Pearl Harbor, after December 7, 1941, changed everything. Brown had volunteered for the Army Air Forces, drawn by something deeper. Some combination of duty and that uniquely American optimism that believed individual action could make a difference. 9 other men shared the cramped interior of the Old Pub with Brown that morning. In the right seat sat Second Lieutenant Spencer Gregg, Luke, called Pinky by everyone, the co-pilot whose steady hands and calm voice would prove invaluable in the hours to come. Behind them, in the cramped navigation compartment, Second Lieutenant Albert Alexander Sodok, called Doc, plotted their course across enemy territory with his charts and sextant and dead reckoning. Second Lieutenant Robert M. Andrews, known as Andy, served as both radio operator and bombardier, responsible for getting those 3 tons of high explosives to the target. In the top turret, surrounded by twin 50 caliber machine guns, sat Sergeant Bertrand Oscar Colombi, a French-Canadian everyone called Frenchie, who also served as the flight engineer. Sergeant Richard Anthony Pechout, called Dick, manned the radio station and auxiliary guns. Sergeant Hugh Sylvester Eckenrode, known to everyone as Eckie, occupied the tail turret, the loneliest and most dangerous position on the plane, where he watched their 6 o'clock for enemy fighters. Sergeant Lloyd Henry Jennings took the left waist gun. Sergeant Alex Yelasanko, the Russian, manned the right waist gun, and Staff Sergeant Samuel Wickham Blackford occupied the ball turret, that sphere of plexiglass and guns suspended beneath the fuselage, where a man curled up like a fetus and watched the ground pass beneath him. These 10 men, most of them barely old enough to vote, carried 12 500-pound bombs toward Bremen, toward the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft factory that churned out the very fighters that would try to kill them. The Old Pub had been assigned to fly in what the bomber crews called Purple Heart Corner, the left rear edge of the formation, where the German fighters always attacked first, where the odds of completing your tour of duty dropped significantly. Brown knew the statistics. Everyone did. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that made completing 25 missions a mathematical improbability. But he didn't dwell on that. You couldn't dwell on it and still climb into the plane each morning. The bomber stream crossed the German border shortly after 11 in the morning, and immediately the sky began to fill with black flowers. Those deceptively beautiful bursts of 88mm flak that could tear a bomber apart or pepper it with red-hot shrapnel. Brown would later describe them as fantastically beautiful black orchids with vivid crimson centers. Nature rendered in high explosive and steel fragments. Death dressed up in terrible beauty. Bremen was defended by more than 250 anti-aircraft guns, and their crews knew their business well. At 27,300 feet, the Old Pub began its 10-minute bomb run, that eternity where you had to fly straight and level no matter what the flak did. had to hold course and speed so the bombardier could line up his Norden bomb sight and put those bombs where they would do the most damage. 2 minutes before bombs away, just as Andy was making his final adjustments, the flak found them. The first burst shattered the plexiglass nose of the bomber, turning it into a gaping hole through which the -60-degree wind shrieked into the cockpit. Another burst struck the No. 2 engine on the left wing, the big, right cyclone, coughing and sputtering, its oil pressure dropping, black smoke trailing behind. The No. 4 engine, already running rough before they'd crossed the coast, began to lose power, had to be throttled back to prevent it from tearing itself apart. Brown felt the big bomber slow, felt it begin to lag behind the formation. In his headset, Andy's voice came through calm and professional. Bombs away, the old pub kicked as 3 tons of high explosive fell toward the smoking city. Below, they'd done their job. Now they just had to get home. But getting home, Brown realized with a cold certainty in his gut, was going to be considerably more difficult than he'd imagined during the mission briefing back at RAF Kimballton that morning. With 2 engines compromised, the old pub couldn't keep up with the formation. Brown pushed the remaining engines as hard as he dared, but the formation pulled ahead, other B-17s disappearing into the distance, leaving the old pub and 1 other damaged bomber alone in the sky. Brown looked over and saw the other plane trailing smoke, watched as it nosed down trying to put out an engine fire, watched as it disappeared into the clouds below. A few seconds later, a red flash lit the clouds from within. The other plane wouldn't be going home. They were alone now, one crippled bomber limping across Germany with hundreds of miles still to go to reach the English Channel. And every German fighter pilot between Bremen and the coast would be looking for stragglers like them. Brown ordered everyone to watch for fighters, to call out anything they saw. The formation provided protection through combined firepower. Dozens of 50-caliber machine guns that could put up a wall of lead that even the bravest German pilot would think twice about flying through. But alone, the old pub had only its own guns, and those were limited. Already some of them had frozen in the -60-degree cold because the ground crew hadn't oiled them properly before takeoff. The bomber began a slow turn. Toward the north, toward the North Sea, toward England, toward home, if they could make it. They couldn't. The German fighters found them at 21,000 feet, 6 Focke-Wulf 190s painted in the mottled grey-green camouflage of the Luftwaffe, fast and deadly and hungry for kills. They came in from ahead and below, the classic head-on attack that gave the bomber crews the least time to aim and fire. And they came in with all guns blazing. 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns stitching lines of destruction across the old pub's airframe. Brown turned the bomber toward them, tried to give Frenchie in the top turret and Andy in the nose a shot. Tried to throw off the fighter's aim. It didn't help much. The German pilots were good, experienced, and they pressed their attacks close before breaking away. The first pass killed Iki. A 20mm cannon shell came through the thin aluminum skin of the tail section and took off the top of Hugh Eckenrode's head, killing him instantly. He slumped over his guns, and the tail section, already damaged by flak, began to disintegrate under the hammer blows of German cannon fire. The entire empennage, the tail assembly that kept the bomber stable and controllable, started to come apart. The hydraulic lines were severed, the control cables cut. The oxygen system ruptured. The fighters made pass after pass, and each pass brought more destruction. The No. 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing, began to burn, flames licking back from the cowling. Brown hit the fire extinguisher button, felt a moment of relief when the flames died, then watched in horror as they flared up again. The plane was flying on 1 engine now, maybe 1.5 if you counted the crippled No. 4. And losing altitude fast. Inside the fuselage, the crew fought desperately to save their ship and each other. Alex Yelasanko took a piece of shrapnel in his leg, a jagged chunk of steel that severed an artery and sent blood. Pumping onto the floor of the bomber, Dick Petchout caught a cannon shell fragment in his eye. The pain so intense he thought his head would explode. Sam Blackford's heating wires shorted out, and his feet began to freeze in the ball turret. frostbite creeping up from his toes. The morphine syrettes they carried for treating the wounded had frozen solid, useless. The oxygen system was gone, and at 21,000 feet, then 20,000, then 19,000 as they continued to drop. The thin air wasn't enough to breathe. Men began to pass out from hypoxia, that insidious killer that steals consciousness without warning. Brown felt the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision, felt his thoughts beginning to slow and blur. Beside him, Pinky Luke slumped forward in his seat, unconscious. Brown tried to shake him awake, but couldn't. Tried to call out to the crew, but his voice wouldn't work properly. The fighters made another pass, and Brown heard the guns, felt the impacts. But it all seemed distant now, unreal, like he was watching it happen to someone else. The old pub rolled into a dive, the nose dropping. The altimeter unwinding. 18,000 feet, 16,000, 14,000. The ground rushed up to meet them, and still Brown couldn't think clearly enough to pull out of the dive. Couldn't make his hands work properly on the controls. They were going in. This was the end. At 3,000 feet, maybe 300 feet above the rooftops of the German town of Oldenburg, Charlie Brown came back to consciousness like a drowning man breaking the surface of the air water. He grabbed the control yoke with both hands and hauled back on it with every ounce of strength he had, his wounded right shoulder screaming in protest. The old pub shuddered, groaned, seemed determined to keep diving, but slowly, so slowly. The nose began to come up. The bomber leveled out so low that Brown could see the faces of German civilians on the street. So low that he thought the belly of the plane might scrape the rooftops. He added power to the one good engine, felt the bomber begin to climb, 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet. Not much altitude, but enough to breathe, enough to think. He looked around the cockpit, assessed the damage. Pinky Luke was starting to come around, shaking his head, trying to clear the hypoxia fog from his brain. The instrument panel was shot to pieces, holes everywhere, half the gauges not working. The windscreen had a hole in it, the size of a basketball. Through the gaps in the torn metal of the fuselage, Brown could see daylight. Could see the German countryside passing below. He called on the intercom, tried to get a status report from the crew. Frenchy Colombi answered from the top turret. His voice shaky but operational. Doc Sadok called in from the navigation station. Reported he was okay, but lost. Andy Andrews responded from the nose. Said he was functional. Dick Petchout said he'd been hit, but could still work. Lloyd Jennings called in from the left waist. Said the right waist gunner Yelasanko was wounded bad, bleeding out. And the tail gunner wasn't answering. Sam Blackford said his feet were frozen, but he was still in the fight. Brown did a quick mental calculation. 1 man dead, several wounded. 1 engine fully operational. Another one limping along. The other 2 dead. No defensive guns except the 2 in the top turret, and 1 in the nose. The other 8 guns frozen or destroyed. No oxygen system, which meant they had to stay low. No hydraulics, which meant no power steering. No power brakes when they landed, if they landed. The rudder was shot away. Half the elevator gone. The bomber was barely controllable, wallowing through the air like a wounded whale. But it was still in the air, and that meant they had a chance. Brown turned the nose north, toward the coast, toward the North Sea. Toward England, it was 120 miles to the German coast. Then another 250 miles across the North Sea to England. In a healthy B-17 at cruise speed, that was less than 2 hours. In the old pub, damaged as she was, barely able to hold altitude at 135 miles per hour. It would take ... Brown didn't finish the calculation, because at that moment, flying low over the German landscape, the old pub passed directly over a Luftwaffe fighter base at Oldenburg. Brown looked down and saw rows of Messerschmitt 19s and Focke-Wulf 190s parked on the tarmac, saw ground crews swarming over them, refueling them, rearming them, getting them ready to go back up and kill more. American bombers. One of those fighters was already taxiing for takeoff. Brown felt his heart sink. They'd survived the flak, survived the fighter attacks, pulled out of a death spiral, and now they were going to die anyway. Shot down over a German airfield by a fighter pilot who would simply take off, climb a few hundred feet, and blow them out of the sky. It was almost funny, in a dark way. Almost. On the ground below, Oberleutnant Ludwig Franz Stigler heard the unmistakable sound of a B-17's Wright Cyclone engines. That deep rumbling growl that every German pilot knew, and most of them feared. Stigler was 43 years old. No, wait, that's wrong. Franz Stigler was 28 years old in December of 1943. A veteran Luftwaffe fighter pilot who had joined the service in 1940 after flying for Deutsche Lufthansa, the civilian airline that would one day become Lufthansa. His father had been a World War I pilot, had flown the rickety canvas and wire machines that dueled over the Western Front. And young Franz had grown up hearing stories of aerial combat, of honor among aviators, of chivalry in the sky. He'd started flying gliders when he was 12 years old, had soloed in a powered aircraft at 18, and had become an instructor pilot in the Luftwaffe before transitioning to fighters. Stigler had seen combat on every front of the war. He'd flown in North Africa with Jag Jeswarder 27, fighting against the British Desert Air Force over the sand and rock of Libya and Egypt, where the heat rose in shimmering waves and the sky was so bright it hurt your eyes even through tinted goggles. He'd flown on the Eastern Front, that frozen hell where Soviet fighters came at you in swarms and the temperatures dropped so low your guns would freeze. He'd flown over the Mediterranean, over Sicily, over Italy, and now he was here in Germany, defending the fatherland against the endless streams of American bombers that came every day, dropping their loads on German cities, killing German civilians, destroying German industry. Stigler had 22 confirmed kills, was just one bomber away from earning the Knight's Cross, the Ritterkreuz, that most coveted of German military decorations that hung at the throat on a ribbon and marked you as one of the elite, one of the best. That morning, December 20th, Stigler had already shot down to B-17s. He'd intercepted a formation over Bremen, had made his attacks from the sun, had sent one fort down trailing fire and smoke, watched as the crew bailed out, parachutes blossoming white against the grey sky. The second one had exploded when his cannon shells found something vital, maybe the bomb load or the fuel tanks, and it had simply ceased to exist, transformed from a flying machine into a cloud of debris in less than a second. 24 kills now. Just one more to go. One more. American bomber and Franz Stigler would have his Knight's Cross. But during the fight over Bremen, a 50 caliber machine gun bullet had found his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. That sleek and deadly fighter painted in winter camouflage had punched through the thin aluminum skin and lodged in the radiator. The coolant was leaking, not fast but steadily, and Stigler knew he had maybe 30 minutes before the engine overheated and seized. He'd broken off from the fight, had limped back to the airfield at Oldenburg, had taxied to the maintenance area where the ground crew was already waiting. They pulled the bullet out, patched the hole, refilled the coolant, topped off the ammunition and sent him back to the cockpit. Stigler was strapping in, was about to fire up the Daimler-Benz engine. When he heard it, the sound of a B-17 overhead, very low, very close. He looked up and saw it, and even from the ground he could tell it was in bad shape. It was flying at maybe 500 feet, barely above the treetops, trailing smoke from one engine, wallowing through the air in a way that told Stigler the pilot was fighting the controls just to keep it level. This was it. This was his 25th kill, the one that would win him the Knight's Cross. Stigler lit off the engine, didn't wait for it to warm up properly, just opened the throttle and started rolling. The ground crew scattered as he taxied fast toward the runway, got clearance from the tower and took off in a steep climbing turn, pulling the nose up aggressively to gain altitude as quickly as possible. The B-17 was already half a mile away, heading north, and Stigler pushed the throttle forward, felt the Messerschmitt accelerate, felt the familiar surge of power as the 1,475 horsepower engine pulled him through the sky. He caught up to the bomber in less than a minute, came up from behind and below. The classic fighter pilot's approach that put you in the target's blind spot until you were ready to attack. Stigler armed his guns. 3 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, enough firepower to saw a bomber in half. He closed to 200 meters, then 100 meters, close enough to see every detail of the damage. Close enough to see the serial number on the tail, or where the tail should have been. The entire empennage was shot to pieces. The tail gunner's position completely destroyed. Stigler could see the gunner slumped over his guns, clearly dead. The rest of the fuselage was riddled with holes, daylight showing through in 100 places. The thin aluminum skin looking like someone had taken a giant shotgun to it. Stigler pulled alongside the bomber, flew formation on its right wing, about 50 feet away, looked across into the cockpit. He could see the two pilots, could see the fear on their faces, as they saw the German fighter with all its guns pointed at them. The pilot, Charlie Brown, was staring at him with eyes as big as saucers, clearly expecting to die in the next few seconds. Stigler looked past the pilots, looked through the gaps in the fuselage, and what he saw made him freeze with his finger on the trigger. Through the torn metal, he could see men moving around in the bomber, could see them providing first aid to wounded comrades, could see the blood on the floor, could see the desperation in their movements. One man was lying on the floor of the fuselage, clearly badly wounded, while another man tried to stop the bleeding with pressure and bandages. In the nose, the bombardier was helping the navigator, who seemed to be wounded as well. These men were no longer combatants. They were wounded, defenseless, trying desperately to save each other and get their shattered airplane home. Stigler thought of a lesson his commanding officer in North Africa had taught him, a man named Gustav Redl, one of the great aces of the Luftwaffe, a man Stigler respected more than anyone else in the service. Redl had gathered his pilots together one day and told them, "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." The principle was clear. You don't kill a helpless enemy. A man descending in a parachute can't fight back, can't defend himself. Shooting him would be murder, not combat. And looking at the crippled B-17, at the wounded men struggling inside it, Stigler realized that shooting them down now would be exactly the same thing. They were in a parachute already. A parachute made of aluminum and fabric instead of silk, but just as helpless, just as defenseless. Stigler took his finger off the trigger. Later, much later, after the war, when he could finally talk about what happened that day, Franz Stigler would say, "To me, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them, and I couldn't shoot them down, but in that moment, flying formation on a crippled enemy bomber over Germany in December of 1943. He didn't think about it in philosophical terms. He just knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't earn his Knight's Cross this way. He couldn't kill these men. But he also couldn't just fly away and leave them to their fate. The B-17 was heading south, deeper into Germany, completely lost at 135 miles per hour, staying low to avoid radar and more fighters. It would take them hours to reach the coast if they were even going the right direction, and they weren't. Stigler pulled ahead of the bomber, came up alongside the cockpit again, and began making hand signals to Charlie Brown. He pointed down emphatically, trying to tell Brown to land, to set the plane down at the nearest airfield and surrender. Brown and his crew would become prisoners of war, would sit out the rest of the conflict in a POW camp, but they'd be alive. They'd get medical treatment for their wounded. They'd survive, but Brown didn't. He just stared at the German fighter, confused and terrified, wondering what game the German was playing. Stigler tried again, pointed down, mouthed the words, "Land, land." But Brown just shook his head. Stigler tried a different approach. He flew ahead of the bomber, turned it, using his fighter as a guide plane to show Brown which direction to go. He pointed west, toward neutral Sweden, just 90 miles away across the Baltic. If Brown could make it to Sweden, he and his crew would be interned for the duration of the war, but safe, treated well, given medical care. The Swedish were neutral, took in both Allied and German airmen who crossed their borders, kept them comfortable until the war ended. But again, Brown didn't understand or didn't want to go to Sweden. He kept the nose pointed north, toward the coast, toward the North Sea, toward England. Even though Stigler was certain the crippled bomber would never make it that far, Stigler felt a mounting sense of frustration. Mixed with respect, this American pilot had courage, had determination, was going to fly his bomber home, or die trying. But he was also heading into the most heavily defended coastline in Europe, the Atlantic Wall, where hundreds of anti-aircraft guns waited to blow anything out of the sky that wasn't flying with German markings. If Brown flew that bomber into the coastal defenses, the flak batteries would tear it apart in seconds. Stigler made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed and quite possibly executed if anyone in the Luftwaffe had known about it. He positioned his Messerschmitt on the B-17's left wing, flying so close that the German fighter's wing was almost touching the American bomber's wing, flying in tight formation the way you'd fly with your wingman in your own squadron, and then he escorted the B-17 toward the coast. He didn't escort it to shoot it down, he escorted it to protect it. Inside the old pub, Charlie Brown's mind was reeling. The German fighter had been there for what felt like forever, sometimes pulling ahead, sometimes dropping back, sometimes flying so close Brown could see the pilot's face, see the iron cross painted on the fuselage, see the yellow nose spinner that marked this as a fighter from a famous unit. Brown's first thought when the fighter appeared was that this was it. They were about to die. He'd ordered Frenchy Colombi to aim the top turret guns at the German Tibby to be ready to fire, hoping maybe they could get in a lucky shot before the German killed them all. But Frenchy had reported that he only had 2 guns working, and Brown realized that even if they fired, even if they hit the German fighter, all it would do is make the pilot angry enough to blow them out of the sky for sure. But the German hadn't fired. Minutes passed, then more minutes, and the German still hadn't fired. Instead, he seemed to be trying to communicate something, pointing and gesturing, flying in a way that seemed almost protective rather than aggressive. Brown didn't trust it. How could you trust a German fighter pilot in the middle of a war? This had to be some kind of trick, some kind of game. Maybe the German was herding them toward a flak battery, or leading them into a trap where more fighters waited. Brown kept expecting the cannon shells to start tearing into the bomber, kept waiting for the explosion that would end everything. They crossed over flat farmland, over small villages, over frozen rivers and snow-covered fields. The Germans stayed with them, sometimes moving ahead to check their course, sometimes dropping back to check their 6 o'clock. They flew for 20 minutes, then 30, the crippled bomber barely holding altitude at 300 feet, so low that if they'd encountered any kind of terrain, they would have flown straight into it. Brown's arms ached from fighting the controls, from wrestling with a plane that wanted to roll over and die, from keeping the wings level with no hydraulic assistance. Pinky Luke helped as much as he could, but mostly Brown flew the plane alone, his wounded shoulder throbbing, his hands cramping on the control yoke. Then Brown saw it ahead, the coastline, the Atlantic Wall, the line of concrete bunkers and gun emplacements that stretched from Norway to France, the most heavily defended coastal zone in the world. He could see the big guns, could see the radar installations, could see the flak towers. Any second now, those guns would open up, would fill the sky with exploding steel, and the old pub, already barely flying, would be blown to pieces. Brown tensed, waited for the inevitable, and then realized something extraordinary was happening. The German fighter had moved even closer, was now flying in such tight formation that the 2 aircraft were almost touching. From the ground, from the flak batteries and radar stations along the coast, all the German gunners would see was a Messerschmitt Bf-109 with its distinctive yellow nose. One of their own fighters. They wouldn't see the B-17 hidden on the Messerschmitt's right side, masked by the German fighter's silhouette. The gunners held their fire. The fighter was too close to the bomber. If they fired, they might hit their own plane. And so the German fighter escorted the American bomber right past the coastal defenses, right over the guns that would have killed them, and out over the North Sea. Franz Stigler kept flying formation with the B-17 until they were 10 miles offshore, until they were well clear of the German coastal defenses. until there was no doubt that the bomber was safe from German ground fire. Only then did he pull away slightly, slide his fighter out to where the bomber crew could see him clearly. He looked across at Charlie Brown one last time, raised his gloved right hand in a salute, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another, from one warrior to another. Then he rolled his Messerschmitt into a hard banking turn and flew back toward Germany, back toward his base, back toward a war that suddenly seemed even more complicated than it had been an hour before. Charlie Brown watched the German fighter disappear into the distance, watched until it was just a speck against the grey sky, then nothing. He sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. The German could have killed them, should have killed them, had every military reason to kill them, had been one bomber away from earning Germany's highest decoration, and had let them go. More than let them go, had protected them, had risked his own life and career to escort them to safety. Why? Brown had no answer. He didn't think he would ever have an answer. But there was no time to ponder the mystery. They still had 250 miles of North Sea to cross, still had to get to England, still had to land a plane that might not be landable. Brown checked his compass, checked his fuel, did the calculations in his head. They had enough fuel, barely. The one good engine, the number one engine on the left wing, was still running smoothly, pushing them along at 135 miles per hour. The number 4 engine was contributing a little bit, maybe 20% power, shaking and rattling, but still turning. 2 hours of flying over cold grey water, and if the engines quit, if something else failed, they'd ditch in the North Sea, and probably not survive more than a few minutes. In water that cold, but the engines kept running. Mile after mile, the B-17 droned on, low over the water. So low that Brown could see the whitecaps on the waves, could see the occasional fishing boat below. The crew did what they could for the wounded. Alex Yelasanko's leg had been bandaged, a tourniquet applied, but he was still bleeding, still fading in and out of consciousness. Dick Petchout's. I was in bad shape, but there wasn't much they could do about it, except give him morphine. Except they couldn't, because the morphine syrettes were frozen. Sam Blackford's feet were frostbitten, swollen and painful, probably damaged permanently. They'd carried Ecky's body forward from the tail, had covered him with a blanket, had said what prayers they could think of. The bomber smelled of blood and oil and cordite, of fear and pain and death. The English coast appeared ahead like a promise, like salvation. Low and grey under the overcast sky, but the most beautiful thing Charlie Brown had ever seen. They crossed the coast near Norfolk, and Brown got on the radio, which miraculously was still working enough to receive, and called for a heading to the nearest airfield. The controller came back immediately, vectored them to RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group, just a few miles inland. Brown nursed the bomber toward the field, dropped the landing gear by emergency extension since the hydraulics were gone, felt the gear lock into place with a reassuring thunk. He lined up on final approach, came in high and fast because he couldn't slow down much with only one engine, and put the big bomber down hard on the runway, without hydraulic brakes. He couldn't stop normally, so he ran off the end of the runway into the grass, ground looped the plane to kill the speed, and finally brought the old pub to a stop. The ground crew and medical personnel were already running toward them. They got the wounded out first, Yelasanko, who would survive but lose his leg, Petchout, who would lose the sight in his injured eye, Blackford, whose feet would eventually heal but would never be quite right again. They removed Ecky's body with respect, covered him completely, carried him to the waiting ambulance. The other crew members climbed out, most of them shaking from cold and shock and adrenaline, most of them shaking from cold and shock and adrenaline, too numb to speak, too exhausted to understand that they were still alive. The smell of burned oil, blood, and cordite hung in the air even after they'd shut down the last engine. Charlie Brown climbed down, last. His legs barely held him, and when his boots touched the frozen tarmac, he felt the solid earth beneath him for the first time in what seemed like years. He looked back at the old pub, the once proud flying fortress now riddled with holes, its aluminum skin shredded, its nose shattered, its tail nearly gone. It looked impossible that such a thing could have stayed in the air, yet somehow it had. The flight surgeon approached, checking the wounded first, then Brown himself. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt empty, grateful, yes, but empty. When the debriefing officer asked him what had happened over Bremen, Brown tried to explain about the German fighter. The man behind the desk raised an eyebrow, scribbled notes, and finally said, "You mean he didn't fire at you, at all?" "No," Brown said quietly. "He could have finished us any time he wanted. But he didn't." The officer frowned. "You're saying he escorted you out?" Brown nodded. "He saluted before he left." There was a long silence. Then the officer said, "Lieutenant, I suggest you keep that part to yourself, you understand." Brown did in wartime. Tales of enemy mercy didn't fit the narrative. The report filed that day mentioned heavy flak, fighter damage, and heroic effort by the crew, but nothing about a German pilot who had spared. Then the story faded into silence. Brown went on flying missions, finished his tour, and returned home when the war ended. He married, raised a family, worked for the State Department, and carried the memory of that day like a quiet secret lodged deep inside him. He told no one, not his crew, not his wife. For decades, Franz Stigler, meanwhile, returned to his base at Oldenburg. He didn't tell anyone either. To have spared an enemy was to invite court-martial, or worse. He told his comrades only that he'd lost the bomber in Cloud. The war ground on Stigler survived, though Germany did not. When it was over, he emigrated to Canada, became a businessman, and tried to build a new life far from the ruins of Europe. But the memory of that battered B-17 haunted him to those faces in the cockpit. Those wounded men fighting to live. He often wondered if they'd made it home. Nearly 50 years passed before fate brought the two men together again in 1986. Charlie Brown, now retired and living in Florida, began searching for the German pilot who had spared him. He placed small ads in veterans' newsletters, wrote to Luftwaffe associations, and described what had happened over Bremen in December 1943. For years, nothing came. Then, in 1990, a letter arrived from Canada. It began simply, "Dear Charles Brown, I was the one when they finally met, two old men with white hair and lined faces. Neither could speak at first, they just looked at each other. Eyes wet with tears neither had expected to shed. Then Stigler stepped forward and wrapped his arms round Brown. 'My God,' he whispered, 'it's you. You made it home. And you,' Brown replied, his voice breaking. 'You're the reason we did.' They sat for hours, sharing stories, filling in the years between. They learned that both had been burdened by the same question. Why me? Why did you spare me? And the answer, when spoken aloud after nearly half a century, was simple. Because it was the right thing to do, their friendship grew close, like brothers. They called each other every week, visited often, spent holidays together with their families. When Brown spoke publicly about their story for the first time, he ended with these words, "Franz Stigler saved more than my life that day. He saved my faith in humanity." When Charlie Brown died in November 2008, Franz Stigler passed away a few months later. Friends said it was as if one couldn't bear to live without the other. Their story, once buried in silence, became one of the most extraordinary true accounts of compassion in wartime. Proof that even in the darkest skies of history, light can still break through.